Well, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. And welcome once again. This cruise, or this section of the World Cruise, we're very privileged to have a man on board who was really right at the centre of one of the iconic moments of the 20th century. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome former military governor of West Berlin, General Sir Robert Corbett.
A tour of inspection at the high security prison at Parkhurst in the Isle of Wight, and he got down there and he thought before he left that as a matter of duty he ought to address the inmates, and so they were assembled in the mess hall by the governor of the prison, and he went down to see them, but just before he got to them he lost his nerve and he didn't really know how to address them. What should he call them? Colleagues? He hoped not. Gentlemen? That wouldn't have been strictly honest. And you know what he said to them? How lovely, how very nice to see so many of you here this afternoon. Which has absolutely nothing to do with what I want to tell you about Berlin. I was extraordinarily lucky. I was 38 years in the army, and I think of all the things that came my way, all the interesting work, there were two things that really stand out. The first was I was fortunate enough to be able to serve in the Falklands at the end of the war in the clearing up phase. And secondly, I was the British Commandant, military governor in Berlin. And that was a very, very remarkable experience because it was such a really dramatic time in the post-war history, of course, of Europe and indeed of the world. I think the first thing I ought to do is just to ask whether there's anybody here who has, I'm sure a number of you have knowledge of Berlin and have been there, but if anybody has actually served there, could they sing out? Yeah. Right, well that's good. I take my hat off to you. And certainly I was fortunate enough to be there in what was probably the most interesting period in the whole of the post-war history of the city. I was working away in the Ministry of Defense in January 1989. In the depths of that place, I was the director of the defense program responsible for budgetary planning over a 10-year period. An extraordinarily complicated job. It was a little bit like working in a submarine. And suddenly, and to me, totally unexpectedly, I was sent for by the Chief of the General Staff and then by the Chief of the Defense Staff and told that I was going to be promoted, I was a brigadier then, and posted to Berlin as the commandant, in other words, the military governor of the British sector of the city. I knew Berlin from previous visits, and I'd like to say a little bit more about that later, if I may, but neither I nor my family, with the possible exception of my incredibly perceptive, not to say psychic wife, my large staff of diplomatic advisors, very capable people, the intelligence staff that I had, our British military mission to the Soviets, called BRICSMIS, our American and French allies, and that includes all the work of the CIA, no one, so far as I know, had any inkling of the extraordinary and dramatic events that were coming our way. And what I'd like to do is talk about this primarily from a personal point of view, but I think it's worthwhile just giving you a little bit of background first, and I've got a short film clip here that should, I hope, enable us to do that. Katie, can you show the film, please?
January the 1st, 1990, the beginning of a new decade, the end of a division, the division of Europe, the division of Germany, the division of Berlin. Suffered. Now they celebrate. Happily and overjoyed, they're making history. On top of the Brandenburg Gate, the landmark of the city. This building points towards the future, just as it did in the May of 1945. Monday, May 8th, 1945, at 2:41 in the morning, General Field Marshal Keitel signed the unconditional surrender in Berlin. At this point, the fighting in Berlin had been over for 6 days. In sheer disbelief, the Berliners look upon peace. They crawl out of their ruins to witness the peculiar silence that spread over their once so vibrant city. Men and women, young and old, have only one thought: life. They associate the red flag with the end of a dictatorship, but they live in fear of tomorrow, a tomorrow with the Russians who will ensure a quick and merciless destruction of all memories of the Nazi regime. With this symbolic exorcism, the Second World War has finally ended. Final toll of the fighting, 50 million people dead. 25 million Germans on the run, bombed out, evacuated, and in prisoner of war camps. Families torn apart. Women without husbands, children without fathers. Countless people wandering throughout Germany in search of their relatives. What future can this little fellow expect to walk into?
Thank you very much, Katie. So what future, what indeed? And I think the first thing to say is that Berlin is and those of you who've been there I'm sure will agree with me, it's a quite extraordinary place. It's a city of recollection with a very strong feeling of the past, even now. And for example, so many buildings in the city remain from the time of Hitler's Third Reich. And Berlin was a place of very real tensions from the end of 1945 onwards. This, by its very existence, as a bastion of Western democracy and capitalism, remembering that it was 100 miles deep within a hardline communist state. It was 100 miles across to the inner German border and West Germany. And those very tenuous lines of communication led to a very strong feeling of isolation in Berlin. And I always remember, whenever I went there was this sort of feeling of live now, for tomorrow we do not know what is around the corner. And not surprisingly, I think that life in Berlin could never be described as normal. And had there been conflict between the Soviet Union and NATO, it's very likely that this would have been over or in some manner related to Berlin. I'm in no doubt at all about that. So the tension levels, of course, came and went. For example, in August 1961, when the wall was put up, that was a time of great tension, naturally enough. In October 61, when American, and let's just see if we can get that, can we get that picture up now? Katie? That's it. American and Soviet tanks were checkpoint Charlie were muzzle to muzzle. And I know from talking to my American colleagues that the main armament were indeed loaded. 300,000 reservists were called up at this time by President Kennedy. We tend to forget that now, but it was a time of great tension. Together, of course, whenever there were shootings along the wall, that really put the tension up as well. But I think the thing to say, really, is that tension and Berlin, those two things were always inseparable, and in Berlin were always very close to the surface. And Berlin always had the potential to act as a tripwire for the Third World War. It had this very special and unique atmosphere. And it's not necessarily easy to recall that now, but Berlin was literally the frontline city of the Cold War. That was the place that it was. And no other place, and no other group of people so clearly epitomized the Cold War issues that were at stake than Berlin and its pretty remarkable people, the Berliners. Just a little bit more history, and please forgive me, but I think it's worthwhile from the point of view of putting this whole thing in context. Much of the situation that I describe had its origins in Berlin's role, first of all, of course, as the traditional capital of Prussia, and then from 1871 of Bismarck's United Germany. And it also stemmed a great deal, I think, from the political and emotional significance of Berlin as the capital city of Kaiser Wilhelm II's Imperial Germany, and of course, of Hitler's Third Reich. So reaching and controlling Berlin became the symbolic military goal of the Allies in the Second World War, and hence its subjugation by an army of 1.5 million Soviet soldiers in April 1945, after a very stubborn defense by an army which was largely composed of the Volkssturm, the equivalent of the Home Guard, old men and young boys in the Hitler Youth. And that resistance is estimated to have caused the Soviets over 300,000 dead. Just imagine that. And the fighting reached the inner city on the 29th of April 1945, and Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker at the edge of Potsdamer Platz in the center there, in the middle of the afternoon on the 30th of April. You can still see the spot where that bunker was if you know where to look. They tried, I think, very hard to hide it. There's a small mound in the middle of a courtyard, well hidden amongst buildings, but you can still see it. Soviet flags flew on the Reichstag. The Reichstag is the Berlin Parliament building, which the Soviets always regarded as the absolute center of German power. And they flew on that building and also on the Brandenburg Gate by May Day. The Reichstag is the building in the background there, as you can see, completely burned out. And when I first saw it, that's exactly how it looked. That's an 88mm anti-aircraft gun. They flew those Soviet flags as Stalin had ordered by May Day. The unconditional surrender was signed by General Field Marshal Keitel. That's him in the center there, with Admiral Dönitz and General Stumpf, the Air Force general, on his right. A thoroughly unpleasant, arrogant piece of work. This was signed just after midnight on the 8th and 9th of May at Marshal Zhukov's headquarters in the East Berlin suburb of Karlshorst. That place is a museum now, and indeed it was a museum when I was there, but going there, it still had the most extraordinary sort of atmosphere about it. In Berlin, perhaps, 3 million people had survived the final battles, but relentless bombing raids by the Royal Air Force by night and by the United States Air Force by day had destroyed about 1/3 of the city. There's the ruined Reichstag building up there, the Brandenburg Gate, and then the Tiergarten with all the trees cut down to provide fuel for people to heat their food and so on with. But the city was effectively, as you saw from that piece of film, ruined. But the future of Berlin had already been decided by the Allies. It was to be divided into 4 sectors: Soviet, United States, British, and at Churchill's insistence, and I think he was actually clever to do this, he insisted that France should also be given a share of responsibility for Berlin. So the expression used was jointly occupied, garrisoned in other words, by the armed forces of each of those powers, Soviet Union, America, Britain, and France. And that had been confirmed at the Potsdam Conference. Here are the sectors as they actually turned out, with the Soviet sector in the east there. It's not a very good map, I'm afraid. The French sector in the north, the British in the center, and what I always really thought was the best part of West Berlin, and the American sector down there in the south. As I say, agreed and confirmed at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, and with Churchill and Truman and Stalin there. And of course, what this did was to put Berlin irrevocably at the epicenter of communist and capitalist rivalry in the Cold War that was to come. And on the 20th of March in 1948, the Soviets refused any further cooperation with the Allied Control Council. That was the body which had been set up immediately after the war for the immediate post-war governance of Germany. The Soviets refused to cooperate with that anymore. That ceased to function. And then on the 16th of June, they walked out of the Allied Kommandatur in Berlin, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but they were never to return. And shortly afterwards, they embarked on an attempt to annex the whole city by imposing a blockade of the western sectors. That began on the 24th of June in 1948. And as I think we all know here, the Allies responded with the Berlin Airlift, which thwarted these plans. Good old Royal Air Force there. 318 days the airlift lasted. They were able to bring in at the start 500 tons per day against the 5,000 tons that were needed to sustain the city. But it's an amazing thought that now to realize that with aircraft and technology as they were in those days, 2.36 million tons were brought in by day and by night flights in fair weather and in foul Coal, food, salt was brought in short Sunderland flying boats, which were obviously capable of dealing with salt water and salt. They landed on the Hartwell Lake. And these commodities, if I can call them that, were delivered in nearly 280,000 flights. What is not generally known is that this was at the cost of 79 Allied lives, 46 of them British. And what's also not generally known is that for the first time in our long history as a nation, bread rationing had to be imposed in Britain because wheat was being diverted from North America to sustain the people of Berlin. And when I used to tell the Berliners that, sometimes you could see literally a tear arrive in the corner of their eye. It meant a great deal to them, that. And I was lucky enough to go to the 50th anniversary celebrations in 1999 of the Airlift, and to meet those marvelous pilots and aircrew who'd taken part in that great endeavor was, I can say, a great privilege. They're very, very special people. And it was an extraordinary achievement, and the blockade was lifted by the Soviets on the 12th of May in 1949, and you could well be forgiven for asking why it failed. I think there were four main reasons. The first and really important one was that Stalin misread the Allied determination to make this thing work and to keep Berlin alive. He misread the Berliners' will to resist. He thought they would crumble, and they never did, never showed any sign of it. It was imposed in the summer, so there was time for the operation to gather momentum before the winter weather set in. And also, he, Stalin, underestimated the Allied capability to do the job. When I say Allied, I mean American and British, because the French were on their knees at the end of the war, and they couldn't contribute. In that same year came the birth of the Federal Republic of Germany with its capital, in 1949, its capital in Bonn, an insignificant Rhineland city, chosen on purpose by the Germans because they were always absolutely determined that they would take Berlin back as their capital, followed rapidly in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, by the establishment of what they called their capital in East Berlin. And West Berlin remained as a separate enclave, garrisoned and protected, and there's the really important word, protected by the British, Americans, and French. Then on the 17th of June in 1953, the workers went on strike in East Berlin and in Eastern Germany too. And the demonstrations, which really took place at that time, very quickly turned into an uprising, which was bloodily crushed by Soviet troops, and many thousands of people were imprisoned. And many of these people were never seen again. In 1955, the GDR was given, in theory at least, GDR, East Germany, full sovereignty by the Soviet Union, and at that time, they joined the Warsaw Pact. And in 1961, the decision was taken to surround West Berlin with a wall, and the reason why was to stem the vast flow of refugees, and there are some of them in the refugee center, who were coming through from the east and actually hemorrhaging out of East Germany. And here are some of the things that were happening. There was the Brandenburg Gate. When I first saw it, that was very much how it looked. Wiring going on there. This is a young man called Konrad Schumann, a very famous photograph. The photographer was watching him for 2 hours. He knew he was going to make a go of it. And at the very moment he jumped, he pressed his shutter and became famous as a result. Wiring going on there. The division of families by the wall, man and child. The wall itself. And the Brandenburg Gate. Very much as I first saw it, and I'll mention that later. And what is also very important to remember is that the order was given at that time to shoot to kill anyone trying to cross this barrier. Now, I hope that that background will be helpful to those of you who may be less familiar with the story. Forgive me for those who know it all well. Now, that was 1961. Of course, it was well before the enormous political changes that were to come in 1989 in Eastern Europe that would bring about the fall of the wall and the opening of frontiers that had so long been closed between East and West Germany. But I think before I go any further, what I'd like to do is just to go back to that film briefly, because to me, the post-war history of Berlin demonstrates an event which I believe is unique in history, because when the Allied armies came to Berlin in July and August 1945, they entered the three western sectors of the city, of course, as conquerors, but remarkably in a very short time. And this was because of the airlift and the sacrifice made in the airlift of our own people's lives. They became protectors, what the Germans called Schutzmächte. And then they became friends. And Berlin was different. I served in both parts of Germany, and I know very well how different they were. They tolerated you in West Germany, but in Berlin, they really did know why you were there, why we were there. And I asked myself, where else in history do you see such an immediate, real, and even poignant example of reconciliation between previously warring people? Which is not to say that for one moment I would condone what the Germans did, but I do think that that, as an example of reconciliation, which is such an extraordinarily important thing in human nature, it is an interesting and important one. But enough of history and politics, and thank you, you've been very patient listening to that. We go back to 61, and by a strange coincidence, I was serving in Germany when the war went up in August of that year. I was a reconnaissance platoon commander in an armored infantry battalion, the Irish Guards. And this is a really embarrassing photograph, and I think I'd better put that one off before it's up there too long. There was a hiatus in the rail link between the inner German border at Helmstedt and the Berlin checkpoint at Marienborn across that piece of East German territory. And I was given charge of, if not the first supply train, one of the very first that was sent through to Berlin when that happened. And my orders were very clear: take this train, ensure that it's not looted, and get it through to Berlin in one piece. And here are my soldiers, who I remember to this day. They looked very scruffy, but they were not really scruffy. The man who subsequently became my Sergeant Major, Jerry Krimble, my driver, Guardsman Nicholas Roach from Gorey in County Wexford. Guardsman Kelly, there were so many Kellys in the Irish Guards, they all had to be given a number. So he was Kelly 46. He was the most marvelous man. He wasn't queuing up for membership of Mensa. In fact, he was incredibly stupid, but he was a wonderful man. And there they were, and here was our movement order from the Russians allowing us through. And we did actually have a big problem along the railway line. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, we'd been up all night long watching the tank factories working in Leipzig and all that sort of thing as we went through. And we passed a party of people's police along the railway line. The train stopped with a juddering halt. Kelly got off the back with this man here, Corporal Tanner, and was promptly arrested, or the Volkspolizei attempted to arrest him. I was there, able to speak German, told them to buzz off. We grabbed him and got him on the platform at the back of the train, whereupon a furious argument took place in which weapons were cocked. And those of you who've been in the service know that that's a prelude to opening fire. So it was a very, very dangerous situation. And luckily, after 4.5 hours, they backed off. Eventually, after we'd bled the air out of the train braking system, we got to Berlin, 14 hours delayed. And after I'd seen to my soldiers, I went to the brigade headquarters to see the brigadier and explain myself. And I honestly thought I was going to get court-martialed. And he said, no, you've done exactly the right thing. What's more, we're going to give you a good time and look after you. And so for the next 48 hours, we were taken around Berlin. And that's a photo which I took with my box brownie of Checkpoint Charlie, as it was then. A fag packet which I found lying on my bunk after I'd been to get the documentation from the Russians, together with a beautiful leather belt with a hammer and sickle on it. Where did you get these from? I said, Schasser, we bargained them. Why did you do that? We thought you'd like it. What did you bargain for them? Oh, half a pack of cards. And they ended up with that stuff, which they ended up giving to me. And here they are, showing how smart that they could look. And I remember to say it yesterday that we were taken inside that ruined building, the Reichstag, and in there we climbed up a long iron ladder. The whole of the building inside was completely burnt out with a whole lot of Cyrillic graffiti on the wall, up into an observation post on the southeast corner. And from the top up there, we together looked down on that site below where the barbed wire on the wall was being prepared by the People's Army around the Brandenburg Gate. And I've often thought how extraordinary that I should have been there at the beginning of all that, and then there in Berlin when the wall broke open and communism collapsed. It's an extraordinary coincidence, that, I thought. So fast forward now to January 1989, and what I was doing was preparing for my appointment, and I needed, obviously, to study the post-war history of what you might call ganz Berlin, the whole of Berlin, both east and west. And I needed to understand how the western sectors were administered by the Allies. And I learned then immediately that the legislative and executive authority in those three western sectors, American, British, and French, was vested in the persona, in the actual people of the Western Allied commandants. And that was the way that it was. And here they were, my French colleague, General Francois Kahn, and it turned out that I'd served in the same French Marine parachute regiment as him, not at the same time, but that meant, of course, that we were immediately on the same footing, And we became great friends. And General Raymond Haddock, who was a brilliant man, really, highly intelligent and able American. And what was so important was that we really all became very good friends, understood and trusted one another. And in the dodgy times that were to come, this was to prove extraordinarily important. And here was Walter Momper, the governing mayor of Berlin. So there they were. And amazingly, I had diplomats under my command. That's me with the American general. And that was my deputy, Minister Michael Burton, looking a little bit like Anthony Eden in his Homburg hat. But he was an extremely able man. And what was so valuable about him was he was not only perhaps one of the cleverest men I've ever worked with, but he was also very robust, very strong character. And that was going to be very important. Here I am with my diplomatic staff. And what is interesting to me, that's my minister there, Michael Burton, my deputy, and Donald Lamont, my political advisor, a very clever man. And it seems that I'm the only one holding a glass. And I'm not really quite sure why that should be so, but anyway, there we are. So most unusual, in fact, unique situation for a soldier to have diplomatic staff under his charge. Our authority was exercised through the Allied Kommandatura. Now, that's a horrible Russo-Germanic name, but that's as it had been agreed at Yalta and in February 45, and then confirmed at Potsdam, July 45. And here's the original Kommandatura when it was operating under four-power control, Kommandatura Berlin, with a Soviet military policeman, British, French, and American. And here's a rather more modern image of that. And you can't see it, but at the back of the room there, that's me chairing the meeting, there is a portrait of General Kotikov, who was the Soviet commandant at the time that the Soviets walked out in 1948. And to give you an idea of the atmosphere of the place, his office was exactly the way that it had been left when he walked out. The Cyrillic writing on the door, everything in the office was exactly the way it had been left. And sometimes I think we used to sort of feel perhaps one day they might come back. But there he was, scowling down at us. They never did come back. And it was a very atmospheric place, that Kommandatura. Now, of course, what was done here was developed in partnership with the democratic institutions in West Berlin. And the day-to-day governance of West Berlin was done by the Senat, the Senate, the Parliament, and the governing mayor. But amazingly, that ultimate authority remained unchanged. And so any law that was passed in Berlin had to be signed off by the commandants. But I do remember, and I'm not, I hope, name-dropping here, that's President von Weizsäcker there. And I remember him very clearly saying, but you know, Commandant, you Allies couldn't stay in Berlin for even one day if the Berliners didn't want you here. And I said, of course, I understand that. But they did want us there. And they made it very plain that they wanted us there. Then what else did I do? I looked at possible types of Berlin crises, severing of communications, a la blockade, very unlikely, I thought, but there were very strong contingency plans for dealing with that, with assistance outside from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe. There would have been possibly increased pressure from East Germany, border guard incidents, especially wall shooting, the possibility of violence spinning over the wall into the west, that sort of thing. And then thirdly, perhaps the challenge from within. In other words, reduced support from the federal German government and opposition, especially by the younger generation, to the political and military presence of the Allies. But these things didn't happen. But look at what actually did happen. It was really a very great surprise. And Leon asked me about this earlier on. It was a great surprise indeed to all of us. But I do remember my darling, clever wife, when we got to Helmstedt at the crossing point, we were on our way up to Berlin in our small motor car, and we were met by British military police escort there. And I remember her looking at all those watchtowers and guards and wire and dogs, and you had to hold your pass up at a curtained window. And I remember her saying to me, but darling, I mean, this is all demonstrably so terribly wrong. It cannot endure. It can't last. And I remember saying to her, no, the wall may become more porous, but effectively this is not going to change. So, you know, was that female intuition, or what was it? She saw something that I certainly didn't see, and something that all the high-priced help that I had around me, and the people that I'd seen in my pre-briefings in Bonn at the embassy there, in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the Ministry of Defense, the last person I saw was Sir Geoffrey Howe. And each time I said to these people, what chance is there of progress here? No chance, no change. The situation is essentially set like that in concrete. but what famous last words those were. And I must say that very early on in my time, as early as February, I arrived in January 89, as early as February, some seeds of doubt were sown in my mind about the durability of Erich Honecker's regime. I'll tell you a story about St. Hedwig's Cathedral. The Cardinal Archbishop Meissner of all Berlin, Roman Catholic, was leaving, and his cathedral was on the east side, St. Hedwig's Cathedral, in a place called the Gendarmenmarkt. And I was asked to go to his farewell service, which indeed I did, dressed in uniform. I could only go across in uniform with an escort and so on. And I was ushered in with my wife and sat in great ceremony in the front row. Just before the service began, the cathedral was packed. In filed 6 men, all wearing dark overcoats, and they were seated, brought in by a priest through a side door, seated in the front row opposite us. They sat down and took absolutely no part in what was a beautiful service, in which many people were in tears because they loved the Archbishop and wanted him to go. Just before the end of the service, those 6 men were again taken by the priest out through a side door, and we never saw them again. And I was the only commandant there, but I went out through the front door, and it took 50 minutes to get away from that church because of the thousands of people thronging outside and all coming and putting their arms around you and saying very quietly in your ear, "Keep on coming to us, because you are our only hope for the future." You can just imagine that. And what an extraordinary experience. And of course, I went back and reported all this, but I was told that the situation wasn't really going to change. But I began to wonder then, and I began to wonder when, for example, in the summer of '89, in August, a young couple tried to get across the Word. They managed to get into the water on the Spree River. They got over the wall on the east side, and they got across to the British bank, risking their lives in the process, where they were being rammed into the bank by a patrol boat, which fortunately had only 1 person in it, so he couldn't use his weapon. And there were some British soldiers there who got them out and rescued them. But it just shows you the extraordinary determination that people had, still as late as that in the summer of '89, to escape from a place where they were extremely unhappy. And that same time, a young couple came across in a balloon, which came down from 6,000 feet. That shows you how desperate people were to get away. And I remember always trying to get a feel for what really was going on the other side of the wall. I used to always try and interview border guards, particularly, who had escaped. One came across in late August '89 in the American sector, and I asked the commandant if I could go and see him. He said, yes, of course. And I went and sat with this young man for an hour. And at the end of it, delightful, very intelligent young man, he was a motor mechanic from down in the south in Saxony. I said to him, what made you risk your life and jump into the Teltow Canal and swim across the way that you did? And he said, oh, well, we had no hope for the future, no hope of travel, no thought of freedom, no real chance for the future. And what is more, he said, for a whole year, I'd been looking for a banana, and I couldn't find one, and so I said, the second word was it, and the first word was in German, but it was very rude. In other words, he'd had enough. So I think the question in my mind was whether these were straws in the wind, or whether they were evidence of a far, far deeper problem in East Germany. And although, as I say, we reported them, nobody really seemed terribly interested. I'd better just give you a quick word about the military situation, which was always supremely important in Berlin. The Allied garrison was 10,000 strong, faced by hugely powerful Soviet and East German forces. To start with, there were 500,000 Soviet forces in the group of Soviet forces Germany between Berlin and the inner German border. There were 300,000 between those two places when I was there, with a tank superiority in many places of at least 10 to 1. So we were a tripwire, not, I think, a tripwire to be scorned, but a tripwire effectively, but we were very much aware of our vulnerability. We now know a lot more about the Warsaw Pact plans to subjugate Berlin in the event of war. And here's rather a busy military map, but it shows you what they actually had in mind. Their mission was to capture the city within 72 hours in a concentric attack like this, using 3 divisions of the People's Army and Soviet support, breaching the wall simultaneously in up to 60 places. And their aim was to strike with heavy armor in from the west here towards the Kaiserdambrücke on the Stadtautobahn, and thus to separate the French in the north, the British in the center, and the Americans in the south. And it was a good plan. And they had also all sorts of other interesting little bit side pieces like capturing the airfields using their air assault regiment, attacking the West Berlin seat of government in Rathaus-Schöneberg and so on. And all this stuff, when we got our hands on it, made very interesting reading. And they were going to occupy the city. And what I think is interesting is that the planning for this operation, which they called Operation Center, continued until 12 months before the fall of the wall. So in other words, it was going on very late on. And when we eventually got across with the collapse of the wall, we found all their armored fighting vehicles fully bombed up with their first and second lines ammunition. Now, in an army, you only ever normally do that if you're preparing for war. And all this was evidenced, too, by the constant rumble of Soviet artillery. We could hear it all night long in our house where we lived on the Havel Lake. And so all these things added to the very atmospheric nature of life in Berlin. But it was a serious business. And here's a British chieftain tank having a bit of fun. But there's no doubt that the effect of a well-trained, well-equipped, and well-motivated division of Allied troops in Berlin was very important. Now, briefly back to the situation in the early summer of '89, and this was when Hungary opened its border with Czechoslovakia and gave permission for resettlers, they were called, from East Germany to come out of their country, Hungary, in September '89, and that was the beginning of the end for Honecker. And I just looked back in my diary recently, and I saw that an awful lot of these refugees are being helped by us in the armed forces because we had the capacity to do it. And in my diary for the week 2nd to the 8th of October '89, I note that we took in 2,000 refugees, and we were providing these people with feeding and shelter in the crisis that represented. But it wasn't until Gorbachev came for the 40th anniversary celebrations of the GDR, great military parade. And when you look at those serried ranks, you could well be forgiven for thinking, you know, nothing can ever shift this lot. But that's a bit of a spoof which I put in there to stop being too serious. But when Gorbachev, and there he is, of course, down there with Honecker and Raisa and a whole lot of unreconstructed communists standing there behind him, when he said at that particular time to Honecker, those who do not learn the lessons of history will be punished by life, it was only then that the penny really dropped and we realized that Honecker was doomed. But what we never understood was how quickly that collapse would take place, how rotten the whole thing was behind the Potemkin facade of what looked like a very powerful, well-ordered, well-organized East Germany. And there was Honecker, that man down there on the bottom right, who in January 1989, Honecker had said, Die Mauer wird noch für weitere 50 oder 100 Jahre bestehen bleiben. The wall will still be standing in 50 to 100 years' time. This wall looked completely solid. He was toppled 11 days after that great parade, and he was succeeded by a party hack, if ever there was one, a horrible man called Egon Krenz. And it was at that time that the unraveling of the German Democratic Republic really began in earnest. There were already demonstrations going on in the great industrial cities in the southern part of the GDR, in Dresden and Leipzig particularly. And those demonstrations spread very quickly up via Erfurt and Gera, right up to the port of Rostock in the northern part of East Germany. And on the 4th of November, a crowd estimated at 1 million people was demonstrating in East Berlin. So for us, it was a complex, and indeed, actually, I have to be honest with you, a rather anxious time, because I'm sure you can see that if that violence that was happening in southern Germany had spread up into the eastern parts of Berlin, and if we had had people fleeing across the wall, perhaps being fired at, what were we going to do about it? Well, we were going to try and protect them, but you can imagine what a dicey operation that would have been. And here, that's me on the left there, talking to the ambassador, Sir Christopher Malaby. And I think you can see from that photograph was taken at that time, what an extraordinarily tense time it was. Then on the 9th of November in '89, the cat was let finally out of the bag when a very low-grade man called Schabowski, he was the Politburo press spokesman, and he had been given permission by Krenz at one of their weekly press conferences to give a little bit of ground, if necessary, and he lost his nerve and said, really, without any pressure, travel restrictions are to be lifted by the East German regime. And I think it was a British reporter at the back of the room who stuck his hand up and said, "But when?" And you could see Schabowski, who was a very limited man, sort of scratching his head and wondering what to say. And he actually said, "Well, with immediate effect." And of course that went round both West and East Berlin like wildfire on the television. And the Volkspolizei, People's Police, were very rapidly overwhelmed at the boarding crossing points into West Berlin. And at 21:20 hours that night, the barriers were raised. And I looked again at my diary, and all I put in for the night of the 9th of November was a busy night. That's the understatement of the year. And other comments about in fact, ordering the police president to mobilize the police reserve and all that sort of thing. And it's estimated that 3 million East Germans crossed over into the West in that weekend. That's with the governing mayor probably asking if he could borrow my hat to keep his head warm. We all know that photograph, I'm sure. And here is the famous Glienicke Bridge where the spy swaps used to take place between Potsdam over there, West Berlin here, and where Gary Powers, for example, came across. And here's some of the traffic. And there are those little trabbies there, East Germans answered to the VW Beetle. They, I think, were a real giveaway as to why the Soviet Empire was certain to lose the Cold War. Those things were potentially lethal in a crash with anything more solid than a wet sponge. There was a minimum of 10 years' wait for people to have one of those, and very often I think it would cost them something like half their life savings to get one. I didn't think they would have been Jeremy Clarkson's favorite, but you just imagine what those people coming across thought when they got into West Berlin and saw the transport that even the most ordinary people were able to have. And here's the famous banana again. And it was really remarkable watching the bewilderment on people's faces and their doubt and then their joy at the realization that they were not going to be forced back and that freedom was within their grasp. And I noted in my diary again that there were some feeble attempts to row back. For example, the Council of Ministers' appeal, I put this in inverted commas, "Our socialist fatherland needs each and everyone." But of course it was to no avail. The die was cast, there was no going back. And what an extraordinary time it was. But just to illustrate the atmosphere of that night, if I may, I'll just tell you a couple of little stories. I had gone out that night to the opening of a new radio station in West Berlin. And Susie was at home in our house, and she was called by my minister, Michael Burton, who said, "Is Robert there?" She said, "No, is it important?" "Well, I think you could say so, Susie. I think the wall's coming down." And sure enough, that was exactly what was happening. And the next thing I saw was my driver, normally a very staid individual, Corporal Burnell, running across the room to me, saying, "Sir, come quickly, or wanted urgently." And I could use the radio telephone in my car. Michael told me very briefly what he could say over an open radio link. And I asked him to start all our plans, putting our plans into effect, and said, "I'll be with you in 15 minutes, and I was. And it was the beginning of a very busy time. And I realized very early on that night that with all these millions of people crossing into the East, hundreds of thousands, with no love whatsoever lost for the Soviets, that their war memorial, which was just on the western side of the sector beside the Brandenburg Gate and guarded by a platoon, 32 Soviet soldiers, Russian soldiers, might well be in some jeopardy because the East Berliners actually hated the Russians. And so I ordered Georg Scherz, the president of the West Berlin police, to put a company, that's 3 platoons, 120 men of his riot police, around the memorial and make sure that under no circumstances would it be interfered with. At 2:30 in the morning, I went to see that they were all right, and indeed they were. And the sentry had a photograph of me in his sentry box and rang the bell, and his officer came out running, a young senior lieutenant, the equivalent of a captain. And I said, "May I come in and speak to you?" He had a German-speaking Dolmetscher, translator with him, so I could communicate with him because I can't speak Russian. And I said, "I want to tell you what's happening insofar as I can." And you could see the feeling of relief as I told him that they were protected and they were not going to be interfered with, coming across his face, because apart from anything else, in the Russians confronted with a general, it's something that worries them very much indeed. And I then went into his guardroom with his permission and spoke to his soldiers for about 30 minutes, all seated very formally around the guardroom. And then I went out, they went out ahead of me, and they were all standing there like that, giving that lovely salute that the Russians give. He marched with me to the gate, and I said, "Good night, good luck, don't worry." and got into my car, and 2 minutes later I got a call from Brigadier Ian Freer, who was the chief of our mission to the Soviets, saying, "General, I have to see you urgently. Something rather remarkable has happened." So I said, "Well, I'll be back in the headquarters in 15 minutes." And there he was waiting for me. He said, "You're not going to believe this, but using a channel of communication that has been blocked since the imposition of the blockade in 1948, has come this message from," here's the Soviet Guard, "has come this message from Army General Snetkov, who's this fellow on the right. And the message says this: 'Thank you for what you have done. It will not be forgotten.'" And sure enough, all the things, the trouble that I've been having with the Soviets, I ordered our engineers to put ropes and ladders into the water on the spray where that young couple had been trying to get across to make it easier if it should happen again. Got a big series of complaints from the Soviets on behalf of Honecker. All those difficulties just disappeared. And a medal came through the post and bottles of vodka and all sorts of things. It was quite remarkable. But I mention it because I think it shows something that the British Army is probably quite good at. It shows you how easy it is to defuse a situation which, had there been shooting down there, and the Soviets are notoriously trigger-happy, could have ended in an absolute bloodbath. So we were extraordinarily lucky that that didn't happen. But out of all this came the most unstoppable, totally unstoppable momentum for change. And that all came from this dramatic time, and that all led, of course, to the rapid move of the reunification of the two Germanys. And here are some images of the wall from that time. These people were called Mauerspechter. Spechter is a woodpecker in German, and they're wall peckers, having the wall down. This one is my darling wife looking through the wall, and some wag sent it to me on my staff and said, there was a caption underneath saying, "Has anyone seen the general?" which I thought was quite nice of them. That's me lurking around down by the wall. That's what the wall very quickly began to look like. Here are some crosses in memoriam to people unknown. Unbekannt means unknown, who've lost their lives trying to get across the wall. And this inscription here, which you won't be able to read, and I can't really read it from here, but I know what it says. It talks about June 88 glasnost and perestroika in East Germany. And it says down below here, Stellungskrieg, positional warfare and emigration in West Berlin. Momper being the governing mayor. Corbett there being the military governor. Thatcher, Bush, and Mitterrand. I demand democracy in West Berlin. So I thought, well, at last I've arrived if my name's being linked with people like that. But it is extraordinary to think what was going on then. Then the dismantling of the wall that began in earnest. We've still got a piece or two at home. And this is a place called Steinstücken, just shows you how the wall really began to disintegrate. And that's me giving a hand in disguise, and I didn't do that. And I didn't do that either. And then, of course, we had some wonderful visitors, of whom I would like to say that this was really the most wonderful of them all. Another one slightly less wonderful, but he's in fact a very nice man, and he wasn't at all difficult to have. Tom King, who was then the Secretary of State for Defense up at the wall. We were besieged by the press, of course, at dear old Trevor MacDonald and Alistair Stewart. And you can see here the press army that was gathered all the way around the horseshoe of the wall with the Brandenburg Gate behind and Unter den Linden leading away to the east. There's a great army of them. And they were pretty demanding. I think that was talking to CNN. Then came the removal of the famous Checkpoint Charlie with himself, myself, making yet another boring speech. And there's Douglas Hurd there, Secretary of State Baker, United States, François Kahn, my French colleague, Roland Dumas, who was the French Foreign Secretary, and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who was the German Foreign Secretary. And Checkpoint Charlie is behind there and was lifted away by a crane at the end of this shenanigans there. And here was the last meeting of the Allied Commandatura, which I, by rotation, was chairing. And that was the last speech I made outside the Allied Commandatura, which is this building here with all the staff behind, and the French and Americans and myself in the middle there. And I do remember, it's terribly, terribly corny this, but the last words that I said in my speech about the Allied Commandatura was, I think that history will prove that the AK was okay. Well, you can't get much more corny than that, but I remember it. Then came the handover in the Berlin Parliament, and that meant signing off the Allies' privileges and duties in West Berlin. And that chap, Donald Lamont, I mentioned earlier, my speechwriter, had put into the speech that I had to give there some wonderful words, a quotation from Winston Churchill. The artificial division of Germany is a tragedy that cannot endure, but the tragedy is now over. And I can remember saying these words, it was in German, Die Tragödie ist jetzt vorbei, and looking up, and there, directly opposite me, closer than where you are in the front row there, was Willy Brandt sitting, the man who'd been the great governing mayor of West Berlin at the time of the wall in 1961, with the tears absolutely pouring down his face. So I thought maybe I'm a better orator than I give myself credit for. And then finally, I was asked to go to the ceremony of German reunification at midnight on the 2nd, 3rd of October, and I will never, as long as I live, forget standing in front of that Reichstag building with a crowd of nigh on 1 million people in the open ground in front of it, and the German flag being hoisted up the 100-foot-high flagpole, the first time that German flag had been hoisted in Berlin since the end of the Second World War, and that great concourse of people singing Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. It really made the hairs go up on the back of my neck. And I don't mean that unpleasantly, but I'm sure you can imagine the sort of sense of history that I, as a British soldier, was confronted with at that moment. And then afterwards, I find myself walking back into the Reichstag building with Chancellor Kohl beside me. He's an enormous, great, tall man. And for want of something to say, trying to be polite, I said, Chancellor, may I congratulate you on this great day for the German people? And he turned and looked at me. I thought, I'd put my foot in it again. And what's he going to say? He looked at me, and he said, we could not possibly have done it without you allies. Thank you. And that, from a proud German, is really quite something. And I'm sure you can see, too, that for me, that young officer climbing to an observation post above the wall, looking at it in its earliest stages of construction inside the ruined shell of that Reichstag building, all that time from that late summer of 1961, for me, the wheel had really come full circle. And for the German people who for so long had wanted unity, but had great problems since, as we all know, but nonetheless, they had achieved freedom, as had countless of millions of people in Eastern Europe. And I think in all this, it would be right for me, bearing in mind my background, to pay tribute to the soldiers and airmen of those three faithful allies, because what you saw there was a perfect example of harmonious and effective inter-allied cooperation. And these allies had secured West Berlin over 4.5, sometimes very testing decades following the defeat of Germany in 1945. I also think it's right to give tribute to the Berliners, because their courage and determination and friendship had, I think, made all the effort worthwhile. And while I say that I would never forgive or condone what the Germans did in the Second World War, what we did for them as people and for countless millions of people must surely have been right. And here, in time-honored fashion, British soldiers giving tea to young people, many of whom were exhausted, having traveled from the far distant corners of East Germany. And they're absolutely young soldiers of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, so typical of what British soldiers have done in kindness, really, since time immemorial. So to conclude, I'd like to quote, if I may, from a letter by a private soldier, remember that, private soldier, not an officer, called William Bayliss, and he wrote at the end of his assignment in Berlin, what really makes a soldier happy in Berlin is that he's stationed within a history-making machine, a city of unusualness. The city possesses atmosphere which cannot be explained, it's just there. In retrospect, it's really a combination of things that makes a soldier say, when he has finished his 2 years of duty here, Ich bin ein Berliner. And it is a new era of history. And I tell you what, it was quite something to have been in the place where it all really began. Thank you so very much for listening to me so patiently. Thank you.